So welcome everyone to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. YIVO, for those of you that may not know, is a really special place for the contemplation, the celebration of Jewish history and Jewish culture. At the center of YIVO is our wonderful archive and library, which has over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books. Scholars and researchers of all sorts come from around the world to use our materials. Unfortunately, that's not happening right now. Not in person anyway, but a lot of our collections are online and they're accessible. And so we encourage you to check them out from wherever you are. In addition to our archive and a library, we do a lot of public programs and educational activities and exhibitions. And right now we are doing them all digitally. So if you are curious to check out what else we've got going on, you can go to yivo.org/explore. You can find us on Facebook and YouTube. And we've got a lot of really interesting content that we're happy to share. So please do find us there. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Eddie Portnoy, our exhibitions curator and academic advisor, who's going to be the MC for the evening. And I'm going to recede into the background. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Welcome all. We're very lucky to have with us this evening, or depending on where you are, this morning, David Slutsky, as I call him. I think that some people call him Slucki. I don't know, maybe, do you want to offer a correction?
It's kind of context dependent. So like in Yiddish settings, it's like Jewish studies settings, it's usually Slutsky. So with YIVO, Slutsky is great.
Okay, then that fits. So let me just do this brief introduction for those of you who don't know him already. David Slutsky is the Lottie Smorgon Associate Professor in Contemporary Jewish Life and Culture at Monash University. He is the author of the International Jewish Labor Bund after 1945 Toward a Global History, and the co-editor of In the Shadows of Memory, the Holocaust and the Third Generation. He's additionally the author of a new book. It is a memoir called Sing This at My Funeral, a memoir of fathers and sons, published recently by Wayne State University Press. It is really an excellent, enjoyable, compelling memoir of what is really first, second, third, and even fourth generation Holocaust material. I will get into this a bit later, but I was really excited by this book for a variety of reasons, because it's very broad and it's very deep. It's really it's quite excellent. But first, I'd like to have David talk a little bit about the book and perhaps do a brief reading. So why don't we get started with that, and then we'll discuss it a bit.
Terrific. Well, thanks for the lovely introduction, Eddie. And I'm so delighted to be talking with you. Yeah, we've been friends for a number of years now, and I'm just like to be able to talk to people I trust what they think is really a pleasure. And also, just for those tuning in, I also just want to do a quick shout out to Alex, who last week or the week before last was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, which is like an incredible achievement. So as well as being a really distinguished sort of leader at YIVO, he is doing incredible creative work. So check out his musical compositions. So the book, Sing This at My Funeral, I conceived of it, I started thinking about writing a memoir about 6 months after my dad died. He died at the end of 2015, and it was somewhere in the middle, probably about August 2016, that I decided to write a memoir, which is kind of strange. I was 31, and it didn't seem like the kind of thing a 31-year-old historian does, write a memoir, but I was really sparked by this sense that I'd been grieving for 8 or 9 months the loss of my father, and one of my responses to the grief was to try and read stuff, read grief memoirs, grief literature. And I just didn't find a lot that sort of spoke to me and the particular experience that I was having. That is you know, losing, like being 30 and being at an age where you've had like a really good, solid relationship. Oh, I sound like I'm underwater. All right. Thank you for the feedback. I'll try something different here. Tell me if that's any better.
It is better.
Oh, great. So, yeah, I kind of hadn't read things that really like spoke to the experience that I was having, like losing a parent like too early, but also like having had this like very rewarding, rich relationship. So I kind of wanted to explore that. That was really the spark of it. And then I went to teach a session at Yiddishkeit LA in their Helix program. And it's tremendous. They're really a tremendous Los Angeles-based organization. So I went out there in August and they asked me to talk about the Bund, and I kind of like on the flight over, I just decided, you know what, I'll talk about the Bund, but I'll sort of talk about it through the lens of my own family history. So, and I guess we'll get into this more, Eddie, that my family had been attached to the Bund for, on my dad's side, 3 generations, on my mum's side, 4 generations. You know, like before the Russian Revolution, they were sort of attached to the Bund. So I thought I'll do that. I'll make it like a kind of, I'll give the bigger story and I'll tell it through this smaller story. And, you know, they weren't kind of leaders or in it. They were just kind of ordinary, you know, my Zeta was a tour. He was just an activist. He wasn't, you know, a big macher. So I did that and it went quite well. And the participants were very receptive, I thought. And I called Helen from the kind of weird monastery that they housed us in Pasadena. And I said to my wife, Helen, I think I'm going to write a book, a memoir, and it's going to be called The Most Boring Memoir Ever Written. Because I kind of saw
it's not. It's not.
That's not a very good plug for it, I know. You know, partly I thought like, I want to write something that I want to read. And I thought, who's interested in this? Like a story of a kid who grew up in suburban Melbourne in this idyllic kind of family. And it was, you know, like the best of circumstances to grow up in. But I did think there were, you know, like talking about that stuff publicly and talking about the history of the Bund through my family story made me realize there were things that I thought were kind of normal that were actually kind of weird. And I'm just, you know, some people might identify with these kind of things. Like I went to the Bundist youth movement and summer camp, SCIF, and every year we would, on one day on summer camp would be devoted to Holocaust commemoration. And I write about this in the book, like to me, it was perfectly normal. But I think if you just grow up going to a summer camp where the focus is like sport and recreation, the idea of like having a very somber day on camp where you don't sing songs and you don't laugh and do raucous things. And when I was really young, you would like have simulations of, you know, the victims' experiences, like simulated death marches. I think I started to realize actually some of this stuff is pretty weird and pretty specific to this like moment in time among Melbourne Jews. Like it's a particular kind of world that creates some of those experiences. So, you know, I sort of thought what started really like as an idea for a grief memoir became this sort of bigger idea for, I don't know, you know, my original subtitle was like a history of the Jewish 20th century. And that's like too ambitious, but certainly like I wanted to tell this bigger story that I think hasn't been kind of told enough about Jews in the last century.
I mean, you know, I could just add that one of the really interesting things for me is, in addition to having this multi-generational memoir, you know, you tell the story of your grandfather, your father, yourself, and even to a limited degree, your son. You have this story that's a very Melbourne or very Australian story. And I think that this is one of the things that in Jewish historiography has really gone under the radar. I'm, you know, also a Jewish historian, and, obviously I could have chosen to study Australian Jewry. I never did, but there is clearly a very rich Jewish culture, transpiring in Australia that I think most people have never heard of, and don't know anything about. And so this is one way to get to it, through a particular familial lens, and through the lens of this very important political organization that existed in a very specific way in Australia, and interestingly enough, still continues to exist there.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I think, you know, the one group of people that do seem to me to be like more and more aware of what's going on in Australia are Yiddishists. You know, like I keep hearing from Yiddishists who say, "Bring me to Melbourne. I want to come to Melbourne," or all these people I know have been to Melbourne, but I haven't got my invitation yet. So, you know, I think that there is kind of growing awareness. It's part of my mission, I think, at the moment, like having moved back to Melbourne recently. You know, one of the things I'm working on now is like, you know, sort of more and more projects that interrogate the history of the history and culture of Melbourne Jews, but also look at it as a kind of global center of Jewish culture, and not just as this outpost. And I think this is something that kind of, we think that Australia is this outpost, but actually, you know, it's an incredibly rich, vibrant center for all kinds of Jewish life. Like I write in the book about, and in my first book about Bundists specifically, and, you know, that is still, as you say, like a vibrant community. But I mean, all shades of Jewish life exist in Melbourne and Sydney. But, you know, so sorry to the Sydney folks out there. I'm very parochial about Melbourne. So yeah, there's a lot going on here, and I think you know, this is one of the stories I wanted to tell in the book, is to show that like there's these histories of Jews that the broader field just doesn't know enough about. And I thought this is one of those areas.
Right, yeah, I found that so interesting. And even YIVO has close connections to Australia. You know, Irene Pletka is on our board. Shelley Freeman is our chief of staff. We have all these sort of Aussie connections, and we all kind of dream of going there. You know, I think that at this point, it'll be a while.
It's going to be some time, yeah.
Right, but you know, eventually, I think hopefully we'll get there. Also, Renata Singer, you know, makes her way. She's works for Kadima.
Right. And I saw your chat the chat with Shelley and Renata and Joe the other day that YIVO hosted as well.
Right. So YIVO does have close Aussie connections. Now, as far as the book goes, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to, I guess, as briefly as possible, just sort of map out the contours of what the book is about, just for the audience so they understand, you know, what exactly we're dealing with.
Sure. So the book is, briefly put, it's a kind of multi-generational memoir. It's about primarily, I would say, my Zayda, Jakub, who was born in Warsaw in 1901. Lost both his parents during World War I, and the stories of their deaths, I think, really shape a lot of the rest of the story, and moves to this small city of Włocławek, just up the Vistula River, which I was lucky enough to visit for the first time just this past November. And he joins the Bund as, we don't know exactly, but maybe as a 16 or 17-year-old. We think he was influenced by his older sister at the time, who later became a communist. He gets married in Włocławek to another party member, Gittel Wiśniewska. They have two sons, Shmulek and Chaim. And the war breaks out in 1939. Zayda flees. They think that, because he's on the Bund committee in the city that they're in, so they think that there's kind of some danger that he'll be targeted particularly by the Nazis, but they kind of imagine that women and children would be spared the worst of it. And actually, it's interesting, you know, like a lot of that part of the story is based on these letters that I found, and I'll talk a bit more about those in a little bit. But there's this sense in the letters, and I've got also some letters that his wife sent to him when he fled to the Soviet Union. There was this sense that he was the one who was in danger, like in their correspondence. Like they thought him going to the Soviet Union, that he was the one that was in danger and not them who were living under Nazi occupation. So he flees. He actually tries to come back to Wrocławek from the Soviet Union in the summer of 1940, gets arrested at the border by the Soviet border control people and sent to Siberia. So he's sent to the farthest reaches of Siberia, to a camp that's, he said, was 2,000 kilometers past Yakutsk. And if anyone's played Risk, you'll know roughly where Yakutsk is on a world map. You know, like one of the coldest places on earth. And they're in this sort of deportee camp for Polish and Jewish deportees. They're released after after Germany invades the Soviet Union, and they're all kind of given their sort of sentences are commuted. And then he has all his possessions and money stolen before he can head back west. So he sees out most of the rest of the war in the city of Yakutsk, where he met my grandmother, although she was much younger than him, and he didn't know yet the fate of his wife and two sons. And they returned back to Poland in 1946. What he didn't know is that his wife and two sons had been sent to Chelmno and were murdered at Chelmno in April 1942. So he comes back to Poland in 1946, marries my grandmother on the way. My father's born in 1948 in Paris. He always used to say, conceived in Poland, born in Paris. So my grandmother was pregnant in Wrocław, and my great aunt Hanya, and I'm not sure if she's tuned in here and listening, but I'll send her the video link later. Hanya was telling me recently when I spoke to her about like how she and my grandmother would hang out in the apartment in Wrocław when my grandmother was pregnant with Dad. So Dad was born in Paris in 1948. They kind of were waiting to see where they could go. They wanted to go to the US, but couldn't get visas. And Zeta had friends from Wrocławek in Australia. So they managed to get visas to Australia. And they sort of raised my dad in this like tight-knit little sort of Bundist community in the suburb of North Carlton, and in this like little cottage that becomes a kind of almost a communal hub, like a place where not just the sort of extended family gather, and they have this like remarkable thing where they have an extended family, but like just ragtag bands of Bundists and working class Australian neighbours and friends from their local school, and it just become this kind of interesting sort of focal point. So Zeta died in 1978 when Dad was about 30, and then my dad was a very distinguished drama teacher and theatre director in Melbourne. Very involved and active in like the Yiddish community and in the Bundist community. So like the book sort of looks at how he takes on that Yiddishist Bundist legacy from my Zeta and tries to like infuse his career with that. He's a drama teacher, but like his way of teaching is so influenced by his socialist values. And his approach to theatre is really influenced by those kinds of values as well. And so the book looks at that and then about how he tried to imbue them in me and my brother. And then, I look at when he died in 2015 and the sort of impact that had. So that, that's like in a nutshell. The book's not quite as chronological as that because it's, it sort of loops around in different ways and I sort of meander through memories. But yeah, that's like the broad outline.
Yeah, I would say that it's less of a meander than you're saying. I actually found the book to be very cleverly constructed. You have a way of, in certain chapters, telling certain stories that are occurring in, pre-war Warsaw, and, they, return to the present or to the 1970s, and they weave in and out of one another in a way that's very readable. And I really thought that was, you know, very clever the way that you did that.
Do go on.
Yeah, I don't want to. I will say that to me, the most interesting character in the book, unfortunately, is not you.
I also think so.
It's your dad. It's Sluggo. Sluggo is a very compelling character, and as you say, he, you know, grew up in this very unique household of, you know, working class Bundist refugees in Melbourne, and he's you know, he's sort of imbued with that entire culture, but he's also very Australian, and he becomes this renowned drama teacher, and who's got, you know, what I imagine to be hundreds, possibly thousands of students who have come under his tutelage, and they all love him. You know, what became very clear to me was that this is a guy who I would have loved to hung out with. He just seemed like a thoroughly enjoyable person. Not that you're not a thoroughly enjoyable person, but he, you know, he was really.
The jury's still out on that one.
No, it's just kidding.
No, I mean, Dad was. Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. Go talk a bit about him.
Dad was a remarkable character. You know, like one of the things that to me was really remarkable about Dad, and one of the things I wanted to show in the book, one of the things I found compelling about him, at least, especially thinking back, is there's this kind of, I think, literary cliche about children of survivors, this sort of second generation figure that they're neurotic and they're maladjusted, and they have this like terrible relationship with their parents, and you know that the kind of Art Spiegelman version of what it means to be the child of survivors. And I think that's like quite common. And it just, you know, it wasn't my experience. Like my dad had in some ways, quite a turbulent childhood, I think, like growing up with a father who was so damaged and loving, but also I think unable in many ways to like be the father figure. You know, like he was already, when Dad was born, 47, and had suffered tremendously in his life. And so he was already an old father age-wise, but like experience-wise, he was basically like a grandfather. And yet Dad grew up to be remarkably well-adjusted and full of self-confidence, and I don't think it was like a simple linear process. Like he went through this period in his 20s where he was kind of a bit lost, and you know, Zeta would write letters to his brother in Los Angeles saying like how worried he was that Dad couldn't kind of find his way, and he didn't have a girlfriend, and although he had girlfriends. But, you know, Zeta was worried that he wouldn't sort of settle down and really find a career. Like Dad didn't know until really like his mid-20s what he wanted to do with his life. And I think in that time, that was kind of unusual. So, but, you know, nonetheless, like he sort of ended up really bucking that cliche. And I don't know if like the cliche holds true, or if it just makes for more interesting like literary fodder, right? Like to have these sort of badly damaged figures. But you know, Dad bucked that trend, and so you're right. Like I think someone said to me like the week after he died, when we were sitting Shiva, it was maybe like the day of his funeral even. I remember sitting at my mum's place, and someone said, "Oh, someone should write a book about him." I was like, "Yeah, okay. Who's going to read that?" But I think, you know, he just was this really interesting, dynamic. Like he was in so many ways like a powerhouse of a figure, and any of his students who like remember him and talk about him just have the fondest memories of how generous and caring he was as a teacher. You know, like one of his former students sent me a photo just yesterday that someone had sent her of Dad, like with his bushy beard, and it must have been like the early 90s, I guess. So yeah, I mean, he I think is was like just this, and he was just quirky as well. Like this is one of the reasons he's so interesting. He was like a quirky guy with some like very distinctive characteristics. Like he made this bet in the late 70s or early 80s, I don't know exactly when, with I think it was a phys ed, phys ed, I don't know what you call it in America, PE teacher. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Phys ed.
Phys ed.
Gym.
With a gym teacher, right, who they made a bet who could wear shorts the longest. And basically he wore shorts every day for the rest of his life as a result of that bet. Like he was a drama teacher who walked around school in his shorts, and like, you know, in a period in the 80s and 90s, they were like shortish. That was the style. And he had his like, you know, socks pulled up with a pencil stuffed down them. And he used to wear scarves. So he was wearing shorts and a scarf. And part of his uniform was his bottle of Diet Coke that he would walk around with all the time. And, you know, he just kind of didn't care what anyone thought about him. And he was like, just did things his own way because he was so, you know, it was something I really admired, I think, as a kid. I don't know if I consciously knew that, but just how self-assured he was, when he might have been more neurotic given his upbringing.
Right, he doesn't seem to be. Actually, there's a photograph in the book of him in the shorts with the pencil and the socks.
Right.
that's you know, you could, if you get the book, you could see the photograph.
I mean, you always knew that Dad had a pencil on hand because there was always one in his sock.
Right. Funny. And so, like, that leads into another, you know, really interesting aspect. You know, earlier you said that, you know, your grandfather wasn't a major figure in the Bund. He was, you know, he was just an activist. He was like a local activist in a relatively small town. And the same goes for your dad. He, you know, he wasn't, you know, a famous drama teacher at a university or at a movie studio or, you know, anything like that. But, you know, he excelled. They both excelled. And what's fascinating to me here is most historiography deals with major figures. And this is a type of historiography that deals with pretty much regular people. And what you find is regular people can be just as compelling as, if not more so, than, you know, major ideologues or politicians or scholars or rabbis or whatever. You know, I found that aspect of this really, really interesting. It was sort of just about, you know, common people who you imagine you would know.
Yeah, that actually sounds right up your
it is
alley, like that.
Yeah.
You know, like because your work deals so much with what you call the downwardly mobile and sort of, you know, and I think that was one of the things I wanted to do as well, like tell this bigger story through just an ordinary, through ordinary people. You know, it certainly, I don't think was what I originally set out to do when I thought about writing the book, you know, but it quickly became like the goal was to, like, there is this bigger picture that they're part of and a much bigger story to tell. And yeah, you don't have to be at the top of an organization or an institution or a movement to tell that story. And in some ways, like, I think, you know, having written a kind of organizational type history before this, in some ways it's harder when you look at the figureheads of groups to then tell the story of the organization itself. Because, you know, like if I write about, this is like a very niche reference from my first book, but if I write about Emanuel Scherer, who was like the head of the World Bund Coordinating Committee for a long time after World War II, he's like this particular curious character, but he really like is not like most Bundists were, you know, like I think to tell the story of a movement like that, it really helps to look at how the ordinary people lived that history. And so, yeah, it was definitely part of what I was trying to do, is like, not just tell my family story, because I think that also has a kind of limited type audience. Like what I'm trying to do with this book is kind of meld what I do as a historian with memoir writing. A kind of like way of writing history that I hadn't seen a lot But I also think historians are very well placed to do this kind of history. Like, we have the kind of, I think, training skills, the eye to be able to like take a story like, you know, your own families and situate it in the bigger trajectory of the times in which they lived. And so, you know, I keep telling colleagues, like, you should write a memoir. And everyone says, well, I'm not that interesting, or I don't think that's what historians do or should do. And I think historians can be some of the best memoirists, because they can, at the same time as like doing a deep dive into a small micro history, they also have the ability to like take the bird's eye view and sort of look at it from, to mix metaphors slightly, look at it from 30,000 feet.
Right, right. Although one of the difficulties, of course, is, you know, historians always look for a paper trail, and, you know, major figures, you know, leave the longest paper trails. You know, that's
Right.
inevitable. You know, so,
and that's hard with family history as well. Like, you depend on whatever is left behind, and
Right.
it's, you know, I was lucky. Like, there are so many points along the way writing this where it was just kind of dumb luck. Like, I knew about these letters that Zeta had written to his brother Mendel in Los Angeles, and someone said, "Oh, Henry, who's my dad's cousin in LA, has them in his somewhere, maybe in his garage." So it was like, and I talk about it in the book, I spent an afternoon with Henry, like going through the garage trying to find this like nondescript little box of letters, which we found. But it's kind of, you know, there were about 40 letters written from 1946 to 1978. There's a couple of gaps, like a few years gap, and which I don't know why, like maybe Mendel threw them out, maybe they went missing. We don't have the letters that Mendel wrote to my Zeta. Because most families, we probably, like when my grandparents died, we probably just threw them in the rubbish when we cleared out the house. So this makes also that kind of family history writing hard. And also, memory's tricky. You know, there were lots of times throughout the process where I would talk to my brother or a cousin or my aunt, and, you know, either I would have a different memory of something to them, or they would disagree with the way I characterized something, and that would sort of necessitate me revisiting that, or sort of thinking about, well, why do different parts of the family have different memories of this event? So that's also like a tricky part of writing this type of history, is like, you're not, you know, the kind of archival sources that you would rely on if you just found a file of someone at YIVO, and they have like this neat collection of a paper trail. You're kind of like scrapping things together. I think to an extent we're all doing that anyway as historians. We're scrapping together what we can.
yeah, I mean, that's the normal thing. I mean, you take letters
Yeah.
that are in archives and you try to, you know, reconstruct something, and if you're able to do that, you know, in a cohesive way, that's great. But you had the, you know, good fortune of doing it while a certain number of people were alive. So
Right.
invariably you'll get different opinions, but you can sort of play them off of one another, and you know, sort of come to some conclusion that, you know, maybe everyone can agree on, or maybe not. Maybe, you know, was there any
Right.
aspect of this that you know, someone's really furious about?
I hope not. I don't think so. Like, I think there are things people disagree with, and people are often, especially family members, will say, well, this is not quite how it happened or something. And one of the things I try and be like upfront about in the book is, you know, as well as this being a work of history, it is a work of memory, and memory is imperfect. And I don't trust my own memories necessarily. You know, like at one point, my brother read a draft of either an early manuscript or the book, and there was some way I described an event at Skiff Camp, and he said, no, that's not how it happened. And my brother has, and I think you're listening, hi Jacob, has a way better memory than me, and particularly like he's 4 years older, so stuff I remember as a 10-year-old, he remembers as a 14-year-old. But like, I remember things happening in a particular way, like it's in somewhere in there that it happened in that particular way. So it's something I have to grapple with. Like, that why is my memory and all our memories so malleable? And then how do we deal with that? And how do we, like, what importance do we ascribe to certain kinds of memories that might not be accurate in the ways we want them to be?
Right. I mean, that's something that everyone really has to wrangle with. It's not an easy thing, and that's why, a memoir versus straight archival history is is really a different thing.
Right.
So there's a moment in the book that I found really compelling, and it's when I think it takes place in 2012 when you go to Warsaw for a conference on the Bund. And you go to the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery, and you're standing with all these participants from this conference, and you sing Die Schwur in the cemetery. And one of the things you note is that, all of these people, some of whom are Jewish, some of whom are not, most of whom aren't from Bundist families, are somehow momentarily united in this sort of communal event. And it, I don't think you say this exactly, but I sort of got the impression that it sort of felt like home in a way. And that's, I found that to be a really consistent theme throughout the book. When your grandparents moved to Carlton Street, this house becomes this, sort of home for many people. Your father's classes became a home. Your own, you attempt this yourself, in Charleston. So I just found this really, this sort of theme of, creating a community to be really important. So I just wondering if you can speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I think the notion of home is complicated it's another one of these things for everyone, right? For all of us. It's probably more complicated than we realize, but it's something I was really conscious of and sort of thinking about those trips I did and I've been now to Poland 3 or 4 times, and each time I have this kind of complicated sense of what it means, like what my relationship is to that place. Like, I don't speak Polish, and so I don't sort of move about easily in that context. So, I kind of, I have this not complicated relationship in that sense of like, oh, it's an anti-Semitic country or anything. Like, I don't think that, but just because of the circumstance of like the way my grandparents left and the way they talked about it, like I remember the first time we went to Poland in 2003 or 4. And I said to my Zeta, who was then my mum's dad, who was then in the hospital, and that we were going to Poland. He was like, oh, what a beautiful city Warsaw is. And he was really excited. And then my grandmother goes, why would you go to such a shitty country? And I mean, she hadn't been there at that stage for nearly 50 years. But, like, that's what we grew up hearing about, that, like how terrible Poland was from survivor grandparents, even though they, I think, had a complicated relationship too. Like, I heard Polish, my grandparents speaking Polish growing up my whole life. Like, that was the language they spoke to. My grandmother spoke to her sisters, to their friends. So like, yeah, this notion of home was, for me, a very complicated one, because of, and also because my Zeta just had so many different homes. Like, he kept getting kicked out of homes for historical reasons because of family stuff. So yeah, I think for him, and especially for my dad, community was very important. Like, he grew up in this just buzzing house that, I mean, when it wasn't buzzing, it wasn't buzzing. And my Zeta worked 16 hours a day or 14 hours a day. So, that was most of the time it wasn't buzzing. But when they were home, it was buzzing. Like, Sundays were the day that everyone came over and the kids would play cricket in the street. For the Americans out there, cricket is a sport that we play in the Commonwealth. And, they would watch, they had one of the first TVs in on the block, so they would watch the Jackie Gleason show, and I think it was called World of Sports or something like that. So, you know, it was like a hub, and I think that really meant a lot to Dad. This sense of like people coming together, and it also led to these kind of porous notions of family. You know, we always talk about cousins who really aren't related to us in terms of blood, but to him, cousin meant something a bit more was something a bit more flexible. So that's, you know, when I talk about my cousins, it's you know, it's a bit of a lottery whether they're actually related, literally or not. But yeah, that sense of community, I think for us has been really important too. But you know, I realized you can't try recreate 501 Canning Street, or at least the myth of it that got passed down to me. Like there's this myth, and not just from my dad, from like his friends, from people who grew up around North Carlton, of Canning Street as this dynamic, vibrant center. Yeah, I can't recreate that. I wouldn't try. We did try, it didn't work. Right. I mean, Charleston was not like where we lived in Charleston was like this very white bourgeois neighborhood. It wasn't like this immigrant center where everyone lived on top of each other. So there were like particular circumstances that led to that kind of sense of community, I think.
Right. But community, nonetheless, it really permeates the book in a really kind of nice way. So we're a little bit tight on time. So I'm wondering if you'd like to read a bit from the book, sure. And then we'll take some questions. So if
sure thing.
There are already a couple of questions in the Q&A section, so we can I can take a look at those.
I'm going to read from chapter 10 about when Dad died. And I'm just going to read one, like a page, if that's all right.
Go right ahead.
I guess it's my prerogative.
It is. It's your show.
Okay, so this is actually from the first chapter I wrote, but it ended up being the last chapter in the book. Sluggo died on December 29th, 2015. It was sudden, unexpected. The shock was unimaginable. An hour earlier, we had spoken on the phone. He had called from Los Angeles to say goodnight to Arthur. We spoke about the everyday banal things, who he had caught up with that day, updates on family, nothing out of the ordinary. Arthur tried to show him his new pajamas and socks over the phone, still trying to work out this old technology, the telephone. It was about 7:20 or 7:25 at night, past Arthur's bedtime. I rushed him off the phone. We'll talk to you tomorrow, I said. We didn't. Arthur went to bed. I did some work. Helen got home around 10 o'clock from yoga. I went to bed down in the basement of the townhouse we had been renting with my parents in Harlem. When Helen rushed down the stairs screaming, I thought she was laughing. Then she told me to sit down. I knew. I don't know why, but there was that look in her eyes. I knew. The call had come from Los Angeles, where my parents were stopping over to visit family and friends on their way home from their 6 weeks with us. Dad had been out walking. He collapsed in the street, suffered a heart attack, and was dead before he arrived at the hospital. Just like that. First thing the next morning, Helen told Arthur. I wanted to, but I wouldn't even have been able to get the words out if I'd tried. My reconstructed version of what she said. I have something very sad to tell you. Last night, Zeta Sluggo got very sick. His heart stopped working and he died. I remember Arthur's reaction. I was sitting on the stairs sobbing, but I don't think I'll easily forget his response. Can you please say that again? He was shocked. He understood the gravity of what Helen was telling him perfectly well. That afternoon, he told Helen, Mummy, I want to die before you. Helen told him that would be a tragedy, that parents should pass before their children. Arthur responded that he didn't want to be lonely by himself. Hopefully, Helen said, you'll have someone that you love when we pass away. But now Bubba Mish is lonely by herself, he answered. Forced to face his own mortality at 3, conscious of how Zeta's death affected us all. I'll stop there.
Okay. Thanks. It's terrific. And also just, you know, so people can see what it looks like.
yes.
Oh, I have a publisher sticker on the front. So, but
I've got, and this is the hard copy, but I would
Oh.
stick with you can get it via, get your local bookstore to get it in. You can get it through the publisher's website. We can maybe, Alex, post a link or something. And if you're in Australia, you can call up your local bookstore like Readings or The Avenue or Dimmock's, Angus and Robertson, Booktopia. They have it online, available online.
Okay, so we have Alex just posted the link.
Thanks, Alex.
So we have a few questions, and I'll read them quickly, just so you can answer them. First one's from Moshe Goldberg. He says, one of the things I noticed and have mentioned is the whole story of Holocaust survivors who lost their family, spouse and children, and then remarried and had second families. I haven't seen much in the literature about this before and thought it was one of the most revealing parts of the book. Can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, I haven't read a lot about that either. And I think that's probably one of those stories I wanted to tell as well, because I think in some ways Zeta was unusual as he was older than most of the survivors around him, I think. So Moish, your dad was his contemporary, but I think for them, like a lot of the survivors in that community, like particularly within the Bund, were like a generation younger. They were like Bubba or your mum's. Sorry, I'm talking like directly to you, Moish, even though I can just see your text there, or your mum's generation. So, I think there was something a little less common about that experience. So Moish, you're saying your grandfather was his contemporary. Okay, got it. Sorry. But yeah, I think there was something. Yes, you're right. Sorry, I just did the maths in my head. Yeah, I think there was something unusual about that story. And I did want to tell that as well. Like, what's the impact of losing your whole family and then rebuilding? And I write about in the book, like how that really damaged Zeta a lot. Like that made the question of parenthood really tough. Dad was named Shmulek in Yiddish. Like his name in English was Charles, but Charles was just the name they gave him because this is the story that we got told. Because when he was born in France and when they signed the paperwork for a birth certificate, he needed a French name. And so they named him after the most famous French person in that era, who was Charles de Gaulle. But I don't know if I doubt my grandmother or grandparents ever once called him Charles. So Shmulek was his name, and he was named, the story goes that he was named for his grandfather who passed away during World War I. And I think it's unavoidable to conclude that he was named after his half-brother who was murdered at Chelmno, who was also Shmuel and named after Zeta's father. So, I mean, I think there's something about that, that is particularly damaging, and made it particularly hard to be a parent. And it was a burden that weighed on him for sure.
Right. All right, next question is from Joy Kestenbaum. How did your family end up in Australia and specifically in Melbourne?
This is relatively simple. Like Zeta had a friend from Botswana who had migrated ahead of him. So they were able to help him secure visas. They would have come to the US because Zeta's brother had already arrived in 1946. Like they'd seen out the war in France, Spain, and then Cuba. And he wanted to join his brother, but they just couldn't get visas. I mean, basically when Mendel, his brother, went to the Jewish Labor Committee, they basically told him they couldn't help and he should just be glad that he had a brother survive. Not very sympathetic. I won't name names. Okay.
All right. Next question is from Golan Moskowitz. Hi, David.
Hi, Golan.
Oh, okay, evidently someone you know. Hi, David. Thank you for this great work. You mentioned the importance of the performing arts in your father's life and the connection he drew between theater and socialist values. I wonder if you could say more about that connection. It also seems to me that a parallel could be drawn with your own process of writing the book, which fuses creative writing with socio-historical research. I'm curious if that fusion of the creative with the historical resonates the way you think about your work.
Thanks for that question. That's really interesting. I mean, I hadn't thought about that, like that as a model, but certainly in
Actually,
terms of...
Can I stop you for 1 second? Because there's another
Sure.
question that that is relevant to that. And I just want to read that as
Sure.
well, so you could try to answer both of them.
For sure.
It's from Paula Michaels. David, I know quite a few historians who late in their mid-late careers turn to writing family history or histories that touch on family stories, like Tina Grossman, Sheila Fitzpatrick, Lisa Heinemann. What made you decide to embrace memoir as a genre instead?
Oh, awesome.
Somewhat
Thanks.
related to that.
Thanks for that, Paula. So I'll start with the first part of Golan's, and then I'll sort of fuse the second part with Paula's question. In terms of like theater and socialism, I mean, basically his sense of theater was that theater should be a place where like everyone has opportunity, everyone is treated with dignity and equally. There were no, like his productions didn't have as best as possible hierarchy. So like one of the things that always struck with me is he never ever, when there was a curtain call at the end of a production, they never did it like the star comes out last. Like it was always a company curtain call, because he really wanted to emphasize that, you know, he was very influenced by, oh my God, I can't believe I'm blanking. Can someone help me out with method acting?
Stanislavski.
Stanislavski, thank Konstantin Stanislavski. This idea that, you know, there's this like sort of famous quote of his that there are no small roles, only small actors. And Dad used to say that to every single student that passed through his classroom and rehearsal space, that, you know, when he would put on Grease, for example, and he would have 200 students in the cast, right? He never, ever turned anyone away from a school production. If you wanted to be in it, you could be in it. He would find you a role if you want to be backstage, or you would be in the company. So he would have these like massive productions with, you know, say 200 students, and every one of them, he would insist that they develop like a character, a backstory. You know, he really made sure that people felt heard and that they mattered. And I think he really directly linked this to his dad's values, like the values that he learned growing up within the Bund, that, you know, the idea that like, I mean, it sounds a bit naff, but like the idea that all people are equal, right? That really like drove him as a teacher and a director. And he really was good at it too. Like he was really good at making people feel like that they really mattered. You know, he loved the rougher kids, the kids from difficult backgrounds who, you know, they were hard at work and they needed extra attention, but like he saved people's lives. Ex-students of his tell me that. I would be in jail without your dad, people tell me. So it really is those values, I think, that sort of tied into his creative practice. He was also like super experimental. Like, you know, they would go to the Adelaide festival, like a performing arts festival every year, and you know, he would send his students out to do all this weird like street theater stuff. You know, in the middle of Rundle Mall, they'd all just drop on their backs and be dead bugs. You know, like dozens of high school students in the middle of this massive arts festival. So yeah, he was quite prolific, and the values really drove what he did. Okay, in terms of like the genre, so Golan, I hadn't thought about it in those terms of like the influence that Dad fusing kind of values with creative practice had, but I think that's, yeah, there's certainly something to that. But in terms of memoir as the genre, I don't know, I just thought there was a kind of compelling story to tell about my dad and his dad, and about the kind of like the sort of longer story. And so, I don't know, it was in some ways a difficult decision, because I was, you know, up for tenure within a couple of years of writing the book. And like, that was a sort of consideration of like, what do I do professionally here? And what's going to sort of serve me in terms of like career advancement. And I just kind of felt this was urgent at the time to tell this particular story. And I sort of put other things on hold because of that. But I don't know, I think memoir just allowed me different kinds of scope to explore the story that I think I might have felt constricted if I had looked at a more sort of straight history, or even just like removed myself from the story. And that was not always it's still not always comfortable. I'm still not that comfortable talking about myself. I'm always in more comfortable territory talking about Dad and Zeta. And so, yeah, that was kind of, you know, as like a trained historian to then insert yourself into the story, like it doesn't come that naturally. So, but, you know, it just, I don't know, just gave me scope to like write in different ways that I thought allowed me to get to the story I want to tell more effectively.
Yeah, I'll say it may not have come naturally to insert yourself into it, but it reads very smoothly. All right, another question from Moshila Alfonso. Did you and your father ever speak Yiddish together? And does your own son speak any Yiddish?
Dad and I spoke Yiddish when we didn't want people around us to understand. So that was mainly the time we like would converse in Yiddish. So it wasn't super often, but I grew up like he only spoke Yiddish to his mum. And, you know, he was a native Yiddish speaker. That was his first language. And, you know, he was as comfortable, I think, in some ways speaking in Yiddish as English. Like my parents, and shout out to my mum, Mish, I know you're there somewhere, did try to speak Yiddish to my older brother when he was a little kid. And Dad said that they just found it too hard day to day to maintain it. I think they just maybe didn't feel like they had the right kind of skills for the world they were living in, the right kind of vocab, the right kind of infrastructure maybe. My son speaking Yiddish is an interesting question because he has just, and this gives me like such an enormous amount of nachas. He just started about 6 or 8 weeks ago at Shalom Aleichem Shul here in Melbourne, and he is learning Yiddish. And it's amazing. Like the nice thing about the homeschooling thing at the moment is I sit at the dining table and he's at the dining table and I hear him like reading out, you know, like a page from Yiddish Kinder Aleph. You know, like my old battered copy from when I was a student at Sholem. So it's really, yeah, it's pretty amazing. We keep telling him that once he learns some more vocab, we're going to start talking to him in Yiddish more. That's great.
That's great. We have a couple more questions. This next one's from Gabby Finder, who you know. I know as well. He says, I have 2 questions. First, David Avipat and I recently published a co-edited book on humor and the Holocaust. I'm the child of survivors, and my grandfather used to tell jokes from Europe. My father still tells some. David, was humor part of your childhood, and was it part of the landscape of your grandparents' home and in your home? Second, with the exception of your Babbe, I find the absence of women in your memoir rather resounding. Can you speak to the absence of women in the memoir?
Thanks, Gabby, and thanks for the plug for Laughter After. You can also find that on the Wayne State website, and keep an eye out. We'll do some more.
Also a great book.
And Eddie wrote some very nice words on the cover for us. So thank you, Eddie.
My pleasure.
I did grow up with humor. My dad. So as some people who know me, and Gabby, you'll know this, I have what I would describe as a kind of like blue sense of humor. And that's because my dad had a very, you know, like very off the wall sense of humor. He could tell dad jokes with the best of them, but also like, you know, I remember Dad like talking to his friends and they would not necessarily sugarcoat the dirty jokes in front of me from a youngish age. So yeah, I mean, I definitely grew up with humor and laughter and kind of off, in some ways, an offbeat sense of humor. I don't know in terms of humor in my grandparents' home. Like Dad used to say that Zeta didn't smile or laugh. So my impression was that my Zeta did not have a sense of humor, at least. And, you know, Bubba was pretty good humored. She wasn't a joke teller or anything, but yeah, we grew up, you know, I think there is this thing about like, we talk about it in the Laughter After book, and it's, quite well known, I think, among people who are sort of observe Jewish humor, like Lachen durch Tränen, you know, laughter through tears. And I think there are ways in which my family did embrace that sense, not universally, but like I certainly grew up with it. On the absence of women, there's kind of like pragmatic reasons. So I don't write much about Helen in the memoir. That's my wife, and I think she's ducked off the call. So I guess I can talk freely about her.
The next book is about Helen.
Entirely. Well, no, because here's the reason. She didn't want to be in it more. You know, I asked her if I could write more about her, and she preferred not to. And, you know, part of what I did when I was writing the book is I tried to respect that. Like, I didn't want this to be a sort of tell-all memoir where I pissed everyone in my family off by airing dirty laundry. That wasn't the aim. So Helen didn't want to be in it more. And my mum was and I guess still is in sort of a period of grieving. And I didn't want that to be, you know, I didn't want that to be super public. So I in a sense, it was kind of trying to respect the privacy of the most important women in my life, which I would like to write about more, but also I think circumstances kind of meant that the focus was really on the fathers and sons and that relationship, those relationships.
Right. So here's another question from, it's not really a question, but from Francis Prince.
Hi, Francis.
We discussed this at the outset, but I'll read it for posterity. It says, "Hi, David. Thank you. I loved your book. This isn't a question, but a comment. It seems that American Jews are always amazed by the richness of Jewish life in Melbourne. For those of us living this reality, your book is nevertheless instructive also for Melbourne Jewry. Our community can learn so much from your book about the place and importance of the Bund and Yiddish culture." So this was just her comment. And we have a couple of questions from YouTube. One of which is,
cool.
You found letters from your grandfather in a relative's garage in LA. How did they react once you translated those letters?
I don't know, because I didn't translate them immediately. I mean, we thought it was a great find, and you know, Henry was really excited because the box we found wasn't only letters from my grandfather. It was just like all this collection of stuff that Mendel had sort of stored. You know, like birthday cards, telegrams, not only from my Zeta, but from all different kinds of friends and family. So I think, you know, for Henry, my cousin in LA, he was just like fascinated to go through all this, and it was like a trip down memory lane for him. And, you know, like the reality is that many people in my family read Yiddish, so they don't need me to translate the letters necessarily to have access to them. But I do think, you know, one of the chapters in the book is I translate the first letter in 1946, where he tells the story of his life in Siberia and how he found out about his family that were left behind in Poland. And, you know, people tell me that that's like a really tough chapter to read. You know, people who even knew the sort of vague contours of that story tell me that they have to put it down at times because it's quite, you know, reading that letter can be quite devastating. And I found it that, you know, the day I found the letter, I was going to, I had an arrangement with a mutual friend of Eddie's and mine, Tony Michaels, for some deli food in Beverly Hills. And on the way, I went to, there was like a UPS store or something to get something to store the letters in. And I got there a bit early and I started reading the first letter, and it was just like this powerful gut punch. Like, to read Zeta's letters, I had heard a lot about him, and my dad had kind of idolized him in ways, but he was so elusive. So then to read those letters gave him a voice for the first time for me. Like, I could in some ways hear his voice in my head in the language in which he spoke. And that was really, because we don't have like home video of him or anything. So that was really pretty remarkable. And then last year in November, I went to Wrocław, and where he wrote the first letters. Like, they lived in Wrocław in Poland from mid 46 to the end of 47, like 18 months. And I went to the apartment building that they lived, which was amazingly still standing. and I sat in a little park bench right next door to it. And I pulled out one of the letters, I had a photocopy, and I read it. Like, it must have been less than 50 meters from where he wrote it. And it was, I mean, it was just an incredibly powerful thing for me to do. And then to read, you know, publicly, like at the University of Wrocław, to read the letter in the city that he lived and wrote, it was amazing. And I mean, the letters are also, just another thing on the letters, my Zeta was such a good writer. You know, like for a guy who was a bookkeeper by trade and a working class guy with really not like much formal education, he was a really eloquent writer. And his Yiddish was like, his writing in Yiddish. You know, one thing I'd love to do one day is like publish more of these letters. But he was really like literary in this way that I think someone said to me recently, it's kind of like, it's a very kind of Bundes thing, right? Like this worker intellectual who at the same time as they have their like job, they also like, I don't know, just have this artistic and creative flair.
That's great. There are two more questions, and then that'll be it. One of these questions from YouTube. I think I could answer this. Does Jakub Pat, author and Bundes figure into this research? I think he doesn't appear in the book.
No, not specifically. I mean, I wrote about him in my first book about the Bund after World War II. He appears in the background of a story that I don't want to tell.
All right.
In the book.
Maybe we'll leave it at that. Okay, and lastly, Madeline Cohen asks, you talked about the opportunity of teaching at Yiddishkeit Helix and how it helped you develop the idea or the need to write the book. Have you found the experience of engaging with memoir and family history has continued to influence your teaching? Maybe that it also connects to your dad as a teacher. Thanks for that, Mendel. And I should also say just a shout out to you, because you were also like at that Helix program, you know, coordinating with me as well. So I'm so glad that you've asked this. Yes, is the answer. I would never have talked about this prior, this kind of stuff. Like I teach about the Holocaust now, and I'll routinely talk about Zeta and his family and their experience as a way to illustrate, like, for example, like the difficult decisions that Polish Jews had to make in September 1939. To talk about Chelmno, I'll like use that family story to illustrate it. So I definitely, and also just to try and show ways that like, you know, we're always looking for those hooks to like make things a bit more human for students. And so like, I have this at my fingertips. And so far students seem to respond really well when I do sort of like meld that scholarly and personal side of things. And that connects to my dad as a teacher. Yeah, he never, like dad never had this sense of like, I'm a teacher between 8:30 and 5, or for him it was much longer because he would work most nights, but like rehearsing. But he didn't separate himself. He was who he was everywhere. And so like that personal, like his students really saw the personal side. You know, I grew up in his classroom and in his rehearsal rooms. And, you know, he would like bring people from his life to come and talk to students. Like he would often just teach, he taught for 20 years in a public school, and would often just bring in survivors that were like friends of his parents to come and talk to students, to teach. It wasn't that they were like doing a play about Jews or the Holocaust, but he thought that was important that they learn about that. So yeah, that is definitely something that I would say I learned it from him, but I didn't embrace it fully until the last few years. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, David. This was a terrific talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Eddie, and thanks, Alex, and thanks for everyone for sticking around and for the questions and engagement. And so nice to see so many familiar names and unfamiliar names.
Okay, so everyone, sing this at my funeral. Fantastic memoir. Thank you again, David Slutsky, and thanks to all of you who tuned in. And check YIVO's schedule for upcoming events. We'll be having many more of these talks as time goes on. I don't know, Alex, if you want to chime in. Maybe you don't.
Sure.
Here he is. He's chiming.
Thank you, sir, very much, David. Thank you, Eddie. This was wonderful. And for those that are curious to see what else we've got going on, go to yivo.org/calendar, and you can explore there. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. And if you go to yivo.org/explore, you can see all the different digital resources that YIVO has, including online classes, which are free, and a variety of other really amazing resources. So we encourage you to check them out and join us again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
For Australians, have a good day. For, New Yorkers, have a good evening.
Schlufka sind hate.
Adank.